Hallo Freunde, willkommen zurück zu .NET API Review. Es ist 10 Uhr in Redmond und wir haben viele Themen, though not many people in attendance. All right. A note to FXDC and anyone paying attention. Uh, a- an issue that was being discussed in Roslyn. We've learned an interesting quirk that we probably should have known, but everyone needs to think about now. If you override toString on a ref struct, you can't ever remove it. So it is a API breaking change to remove an override of toString because of constrained calls. So the only reason they're allowed to work is because the compiler knows it doesn't have to box, and as soon as you take it away, then now it becomes a boxed call to object.toString, and then the universe implodes. It's total protonic inversion. Don't do it. So there we go. At some point, I'll get around to updating our breaking change guidelines and putting it on my notes to put in the FDG4 if we ever make one and whatnot. But it is a thing that we have learned, so keep it in mind. All right. First up today, LDAP session options, certificate directory property 104260.
Normally, Steve would be the person to talk to that, but it looks like he's not here today.
He said he'd be late.
Okay.
Other Steve. Harder.
Oh, okay.
We can give Steve Harder some more time to join and just loop back to this at the end. I'll ping him.
Okay. Vector 128 Shuffle Native 81609.
Yeah, so this is one that we've actually already reviewed and approved, but when we took it to review, the reviewed and approved name was Shuffle Unsafe. And during the same release cycle, so .NET 9, we also reviewed the convert to integer native proposal, which was originally proposed as convert to integer unsafe. And during that review, there was discussion on what the suffix of unsafe meant, and it was determined that unsafe wasn't appropriate for the convert to integer case, and native was a more appropriate use instead, because the behavior uh, it wasn't unsafe or dangerous. It was just that uh, the edge case behavior became platform dependent, and therefore dependent on native. Uh, so it was decided that we should take this one back and determine if the same change should apply there. That is, should we expose this as shuffle native instead, or if the already approved name of shuffle unsafe is fine. Um, this has the same consideration as the convert to integer native APIs, which is that these aren't dangerous. They don't cause faults or exceptions to be thrown or anything like that. The only consideration is that if the indus you provide is outside the range of the vector count, then what value you get in there uh, is either going to be uh, 0, as in it force zeros, which is the way the regular Shuffle API behaves, or it's going to be a platform-specific value. For example, on x86, the way that a lot of the APIs work is they effectively mask the indices, and so it will wrap around to pick any valid element between that's already in the vector, rather than zeroing it. So if you had a vector 128 which has 4, and you provided the value 4, you would mask it against against 3, and it becomes 0. So it works kind of like overshifting does on x86 in most cases. Um, Or in the case of byte, if the most significant bit is set, then it zeros. Otherwise, it behaves functionally like a mask. So it does have that same native behavior where it's not unsafe. It's just it becomes a, I know that none of my inputs are out of range, and I'm okay if it doesn't strictly zero this and rather picks a different value from the vector.
Yeah, so just to kind of recap what you said, it's never going to choose uninitialized memory, correct? It's always going to choose from the set of elements given to it. It's just maybe not necessarily the one that you wanted.
Correct.
That's okay.
Yeah. So it,
Yeah, and that's the distinction that we made kind of with convert to integer native between the using the new native suffix we decided on versus unsafe was, is it actually doing something that's potentially dangerous or undefined versus is it doing something well defined but potentially non-deterministic based on the hardware you're on.
yeah. So is it that like that ARM or some ARM chips might clamp and x86 only reads the bottom in bits?
Yes, functionally.
Okay. And what's our software going to do?
The software implementation will do the platform native behavior, but the fallback implementation for some unaccelerated piece of hardware is that it just calls shuffle, and so therefore any out of bound indices will zero, just like the regular shuffle API does.
Okay. And yeah, I mean like what are we going to do on hardware that we don't know that there's an intrinsic for?
Yeah, that's where it's just going to defer to the existing shuffle API, and that's what we did with convert to integer native as well. It's if there is an acceleration pattern for that platform, it will accelerate. Otherwise, we fall back to the same behavior as the non-native API. So that is the deterministic behavior.
So if you have a valid bound 0 through 15, and in your indices you pass 16 through 31, then on a software fallback you're going to get a broadcast of the 0 element, but on
No,
x86 you'll get it'll be a no-op because everything will say go to its same position.
Rather than broadcasting the 0, it's zeroing the destination value.
Ah.
Yeah.
So out of bounds read is read from 0, not read element 0. Okay.
It's set to 0, not
Yeah.
it's not doing a read. It's just
Sure.
yeah.
Sorry, reading from dev 0. Okay. And this API doesn't care that the indices are unique. It could be used for broadcast if you wanted.
Yeah, you can use it for any type of permutation of the values you want. So you can select the same element for every index. You can you can just select even odd elements. You can reorder it any way you want.
Okay.
So earlier when you said it was non-deterministic, is it deterministic on any given platform? It's just you don't know what platform you'll run on?
Right. It's deterministic within the confines of a single run. But if you are running on, let's say, AVX512 capable hardware versus AVX capable hardware, then you could see a difference between those. Or if you're running on ARM versus x64, and that non-determinism there only applies to out of bound indices. Anything in bounds is still strictly well defined and deterministic across all of those.
I have no goals with this. It seems reasonable.
Sounds good to me. Seems like it follows patterns we've done.
Like the main complication just seems that it's going to be documentation more than anything else. But
right. Yeah, and it's one of the APIs that we determined having the fully deterministic API is goodness, and it's what we want many users to use. But there's cases, including in our own span helpers and stuff, where we deterministically know that the indices are well formed, but the JIT, there's no way for us to convey that information to the JIT. And we want to be able to say, you don't need to go and do special handling to handle these out of bound indices, because I'm either comfortable with any result for those, or because I've already determined they're well formed myself.
Mhm.
Okay, and then because I can never remember, do we need to do anything for the non-numbered vector? And is it correct that none of these are extensions?
It's so for the first one, we can't expose an arbitrary shuffle for a vector for the variable length vector of t, because there's no way to easily create the indices that represent it, because you don't know how many indices you need to provide. And so it gets a little bit weird with trying to say, oh, I want to shuffle, and trying to simultaneously understand I need to provide valid indices for any potential length of vector of t. There's just no good way to do that, so we don't expose the shuffle API there.
Okay.
For the other question, I remember. Could you repeat what the other question was?
I
have
just
an answer.
these are on the non-generic.
Oh yeah,
and they're
extension.
not extensions. So
Yeah.
I'm just making sure that's right.
Yeah, this is a case where I have no concerns with them being extensions. There's benefit to some users if they want to use them as extensions, but it really comes down to personal preference, and it's not. We've got a number of APIs where we've not made them extensions because they wouldn't be extensions in many other cases. Like, for example, some people want the sum method to be an extension, and it's not today. You do vector128.sum and pass in the input, but there's no problem with it being an extension theoretically. We just didn't do that. So if API Review wants to make this an extension and just put this in front of it, I think that's fine, but I don't think there's a requirement for it.
Well, is shuffle an extension method?
It's not today, so
so that'd be weird. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure the annotations were right.
Yeah, it's explicit that it is a static method to avoid the by-ref that would otherwise be taken for this. We don't want to force the address taken. We want it to be by value. But if someone in the future had enough reason to say, I really just want this to be an extension method, we could just make it at that point, take it back to API Review, get it approved, and do that.
Yep.
One more quick question, Tanner. You map float to int, but double to ulong. Why is one signed and one not?
Copy paste error. That one should be long.
Okay.
We typically match signedness for double and float.
Okay.
Yoink. All right. Path dot contains invalid path char and or contains invalid file name char 110301.
Yeah, I can talk about that one. So, as of today, the way someone will check if a path contains valid characters is by calling path.contains_any and then calling getInvalid path chars or getInvalid file name chars. And this is not the most efficient because those methods always return any array. So most people find themselves just catching the array and performing the check I just mentioned. So this proposal is just about adding Boolean helpers that will make that operation for you. And internally, those helpers will use a static field to avoid the allocation of the current alternative. I can add something more here that we already exposed a static read-only field called invalid chars, which was obsoleted. And the reason for the obsolescence was that it was a risk to use if untrusted code happened to overwrite these elements. But I consulted with the security experts, and it seems like this might no longer be a concern anymore after Cass was killed. So hence making this proposal viable, because otherwise that simply could have applied to this API.
Yeah, I think it's fine to have the contains invalid path char, even if we have the array exposed, because it definitely moves you more into the declared intent of code instead of reading the notion of like, is the index of this greater than 0? Greater than or equal to 0? Yeah. So I think it's fine.
The only beef I have with this API, as it were, is like, what do you intend on doing with the result? Because even in the issue, like the person who opened this says like, yeah, if it returns false, it doesn't mean it's actually legal to open a file with that name.
So the point is that this allocation doesn't matter because it's going to be an error path.
Right, you're handling the error twice basically if you use this, because you still have to handle the second possible error when you try to create the file, right?
Right.
So are you saying that we should have instead of like a throw helper or something?
No,
that throws?
I'm just wondering like what. So if this method returns true or returns false, like, what do you expect somebody to do?
Yeah, throw, most likely.
So if the method returns true, they throw, and if it returns false, what do they do?
If it returns false, you said, well, they just continue execution.
And what? I guess I should maybe ask a more basic question. Why might somebody call this API?
In order to guard, just to guard that the path provided is not valid.
What does valid mean?
That doesn't contain those characters.
Yeah, but why those characters specifically?
Well, there's.
I saw Jeremy smirk because he knows where I'm going with this.
No, the answer for all of this is always UI.
Yeah.
Right, you've got the little text box of type in the name you want to save the file as, and if you contain an invalid file name char, it can highlight it in red and disable the go button because it knows it's not going to work. So it's putting the error in your face instead of waiting for the file system.
Yeah,
right, but this wouldn't allow you to highlight the character. It's simple yes or no, which creating the file also kind of gives you a simple yes or no, whether that can succeed. So
no,
I think,
but you're not going to like try calling create file every time somebody types another letter in a text box.
So, by the way, like, if contains invalid file name char returns true, the file creation might still succeed because contains invalid file name char checks for things like slashes. And you can absolutely put a slash in a path on a file system.
That's
it just means you're doing directory traversal.
right, you might need additional checks as well, right?
Well, you might be trying to stop them from doing directory traversal.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm with that, right? If you're trying to stop them from performing directory traversal, that implies that the input is coming from an untrusted entity.
Or you're just trying to get them to save it in the right directory.
Yeah. But should colon be allowed?
Well, that depends on. I mean, we have right now those lists are just like one for Unix, and it's only the null character there, and then a bunch of other characters on Windows. Should colon be allowed? I guess it depends on. on the platform.
I mean, the answer
well,
is
for the file name cars, we also disallow the directory separator on Unix. It looks like,
yeah.
but not the path. Yeah, I see. So
I mean,
that's the only difference on Unix.
we expose the two structures. This is just taking a thing that people often call and wrapping it in a named method.
Right.
Like,
Yes, and from that perspective, it's fine. But I've seen people not understand what the original API does. And if we're saying we think that the original API is called frequently enough, where we want to introduce another accelerator for it, then we should probably reconsider what are the cases where people are calling the original API, and do we need to kind of steer them into a path of righteousness, as it were?
I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, I was with you, Levi, but I think Jeremy made a good point about like a per character check, kind of like not wanting to make syscalls, right? And like it's nice to be proactive, like so. I see the purpose, right? And will this steer people to like not handle file creation errors or whatever? Like probably not. Like they'll, but maybe.
So the scenario that Jeremy gave earlier is a UI-based application where someone's presumably sitting at a terminal typing in a file name into a UI. That's very different than somebody typing a name into a web interface and submitting that. Because on a UI, like, you're generally just affecting your own file system. Through a web interface, you're affecting potentially the server's file system. Like, a boundary has been crossed there. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do this. I'm just saying tread lightly here, because if you're introducing an accelerator for something that I believe people currently get incorrect, are we going to simply push more people down the incorrect path? Mostly this is a doc issue probably, but just be aware of it.
The thing I was going to ask is contains here is nice, but should there be an index of? So we have the contains and index of pair. That way users can either do the simple check or they can do things like highlight what character is incorrect rather than just saying invalid path or invalid, file name, invalid input.
I was wondering if someone was going to say that when Jeremy brought up the point that this didn't return an index, but I feel like that's the way. Like this is a good like parliamentary tactic. Like try to expand the proposal to the point where like no one wants to take it anymore, because then we have like 4 methods. When like it's like maybe the array is good enough.
yeah, I mean,
and maybe it is.
Yeah. So. Which actually comes to if all we care is the people who are already calling the thing to get rid of the array allocation, then yeah, this is the better proposal. It's the more empowering one. Or if we felt that we wanted it to be the read-only span static property thing, then we could do that too.
The thing about search values is you can't actually enumerate all of the different values inside of it. You can only ask, is a particular value inside of it? But I mean,
good thing you
have
have the array.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. If you're gonna enumerate it, then you should like probably do it in a way. Yeah, it's weird. Like, because even with the allocation, like performance sensitive code can obviously cache the result very easily, but like, obviously people might not think to do that. So like what's the intent of this proposal? Are we trying to give people the most powerful tool, or are we trying to like make it more discoverable? Are we trying to teach people about search values? I don't know.
So I mean, I guess the question, so Levi's suggesting that basically no one should be reading invalid path chars or invalid file name chars, at least taking his thing to the extreme. So
correct.
So I mean, there's 2 things. One is say anybody who's calling this is wrong and we don't care and we shouldn't do nothing. The other is they actually have valid scenarios and we should get rid of every library has their own copy of it because they've been trained to call the new array allocating one. Not just because of untrusted code, but because some people are stupid and modify arrays that they're given. And the So exposing it as a read-only span of char would solve that. Now you're back to you actually need bad code to turn the read-only span of char into a pointer and start overwriting memory, which I think generally we say we don't care about.
Yeah.
And so I think from Levi's position, it's we should do nothing here or the span thing. And
Read only span, not search values, so you can enumerate it.
yeah, I mean, you could call contains any, you could enumerate it, you could turn it into your own array, but search values, I think once you go in, you can't come back out.
Yeah, raws of char seems more understandable than search values of char for most callers. I mean, that doesn't address my original complaint, but I think returning raws of char is a more understandable, a more generalized API surface than just a true-false method.
There's been some discussion in chat of talking about how these things are wrong anyway because on, particularly on Linux, it's common to have multiple different file systems mounted, and you have them mounted in subpaths. And well, just because ext2 generally says this is a valid file name character, once you hit /mount/ something on a CIF share, it may not agree. And
yeah, and in fairness,
Right. Well, that's why on Unix this is literally does not contain null, right?
Yeah.
At least for the file name. So yeah, it's definitely not going to catch most things that might not be valid on various file systems.
But if all we're doing is taking the existing thing and giving the accidental write protection while removing an allocation, then the raws char seems fine.
And to be perfectly honest, my earlier point was, why do you care if a file name contains an invalid character? The answer is probably that you want to restrict it to only known good characters, which means you should be doing an allow list check, not a deny list check.
I would say I would be more supportive of this proposal if the array contained more than null on Unix, because this looks like a portable API, and I mean it is, but you run it on Windows, it's going to do one thing. You run it on Linux, and you could have just searched the string for null. And I don't think we'll ever change that, right? Because at this point of debreaking, and it's just what's the point of this API? But yeah.
I mean, is the file name dot valid? According to this API, the answer is yes. And I'm not aware of any file system in existence that allows that.
Well, that's because dot is technically a valid file name. It's just not a valid user specifiable file name.
Yes.
Yeah, it's already taken.
Yes.
Well, I guess that kind of gets into the point of a lot of people assume that if something's if you have a query of is X, they assume that that is a binary statement of if it returns true, it means true. If it returns false, then it means the inverse is true. When in practice, you have things like is even integer, where that does not imply it returning false does not imply the number is odd. It could be neither, because you can have even, odd, and neither as the tri-state of the question, is it even or odd? And so for this, you can have the does it contain any invalid characters, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is valid.
Yeah. If we were to do something, if you were to kind of restructure this in the sense of how do people get the same information without allocation, because they want to really optimize performance, then I think going down a raws char is probably going to be the right idea. With all the same caveats that you probably shouldn't be calling this API in the first place, but if you really need it, here's the raws char instead of the allocating API. Go wild.
Honestly, one of the things I dislike about this the most is it doesn't look like a Windows specific API, and I know it isn't, but there are a lot of people migrating like Windows apps to Unix, and this is, I think, a huge foot gun for that. Because you like test it on Windows and it like blocks a bunch of characters, and like, yeah, I don't know.
And the same foot gun applies to WSL, because someone's going to be in WSL and pass /int/d/ path to a Windows folder, and it's going to be invalid there.
Okay, so I don't know. My spirit's broken.
No. This is a healthy discussion, right?
So cool. Is an alternative to switch the behavior of the existing valid path chars to just return a cache array.
No, because that has the same, like, now you definitely have somebody called it. It's always returned a new array, and they feel like calling get invalid path char and replace colon with a potato emoji. Like, so the problem with exposing the array is, what if someone thinks they own it and overwrites one of the values?
Right, and it's one thing if you ask cast to read only span, but it actually looks semi-natural with the array to overwrite an element. Or unsafe paths.
Right.
Yes. __, is that like, you gotta put it at the beginning? Are we Python now? No.
Yeah. So invalid path chars is the name of the array, so we can't use that.
Is it an actual field today?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we have both the field and the get method.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I don't think we have one. I think the file name chars is only the array returning method.
Right, because it was added later, I think.
So, I mean, the file name one we could just put an S on the end, but
What do you mean, is it an actual field today? Like, I don't think it is, right?
It
it's
is.
just like,
Yeah,
Private-
path
public
dot
static.
invalid path chars is a field.
yeah, public static read only char array.
okay.
Which is its own issue, because it's a public static read-only field, and we're not supposed to expose
Yeah.
public fields. That should have been a property wrapping a static read-only field, potentially.
I mean, we're talking like the Net Framework 1.0 days. Come on.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we can turn the plural into span, so invalid path char span. It's
Wait, what's the name? So it's invalid path chars. Okay, it must be in another file.
I mean, theoretically, it's
probably-
in a common file that just calls the get invalid path chars, because all file systems need to define it. But
Well,
Jeremy, sorry, why is not plural? Why is char instead of chars?
well, we can't just say chars because that name's taken. So we can say chars span, but that feels
Yeah.
Wrong.
I would do that actually, and make it a get method. That way, it sits right next to the existing get methods. Because the field has already been deprecated, and there's only one field anyway, but both methods exist. So it's a natural thing that it can sit next to,
And then we wouldn't have to update the obsolete attribute.
right?
so you want chars span.
Yeah, like it's weird, but it's literally the same method name, just with span at the end.
We clearly just need to allow overloading by
Return type.
return type. Just like implicit conversions.
And the reason why we want read-only span char is instead of search values is because it's more discoverable, more user-friendly.
You can do more stuff with it.
You can see what the values are instead of just call index of.
Ah, okay.
And I
Which,
think,
yeah, it's like really. I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, yeah, it's I think useful when debugging, right? Like, or I mean, obviously, search values might have a good debug view, but being able to for each and write things and stuff like that.
I mean, the implementation of this method would literally just be to return a string.
Oh, we could return a string, you said, instead of a read-only. I mean, you could, yeah.
I mean, it would be
with
a
a null
raw star.
character. Yeah. Which is super friendly.
Well, I mean, he's saying the implementation would return a system.string, not.
Oh, I see.
Oh,
Implementation,
yeah.
not the actual
Yeah.
signature.
No, but the caller would never know, right? It's all just a raw star.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it's definitely good to communicate it as a raw char than a string if it's going to include null.
Yeah.
Are we in agreement though that we want more ways to expose this?
It's just a non-allocating way to do it if you happen to call it frequently in your code. But as a caller, you can just cache it yourself.
It's basically, should I cache a one-time allocation or can I have it fully allocation free?
Yeah.
And if you do need a search values, notably, you can just do search values create get invalid path cares span.
Or array, right? And then it's all cached. If you
Sure.
you want to cache the search
Yeah.
values anyway. Like you definitely don't want to do that repeatedly.
Yeah.
But
Or we say Levi's suggestion that everybody who's calling this is wrong is right and do nothing.
I don't like. I never speak in generalizations. I say generally. So yes.
I think that's I never speak in
I don't
absolutes.
want to. I'm not trying to beat down anyone's spirit, but really for me, the sticking point is just how useless this is on Unix, right? Like if you know you're running this on Unix, like just compare to null, and it looks like a cross-platform API, but the behavior changes dramatically on Windows and Unix.
The real sticking point that I have again is just that if you're calling this API, you're probably doing it because you intend to implement a policy engine, and this API doesn't actually help you implement any useful policy engine for the same reason Steph gave.
You could expose it as get common invalid path characters, in which case you're basically saying this is the set that's common across Linux and Windows. It may not be expansive, but it gives you the set that you might care about for WSL scenarios or NTFS mounts or anything. And then it's very clear that this isn't expansive set, it's just the common set that you might want to exclude.
But I mean, the common almost sounds like it's the intersection, whereas I would almost want just the Windows version everywhere. You know what I mean? It's just like, be at, of the behaviors we have today, like, yeah, be the most strict, like count the most characters as invalid. There was another linked proposal that someone claimed in the comments was a dupe. It's not exactly a dupe, but it was asking for is portable kind of check for a file name, which would be kind of hard to define. But again, it seems more useful than a check that just checks for a null character in a string on Unix.
Get non-portable path care span.
So you want the valid ones or the invalid ones?
And get non-portable, so it'd still be the ones that are invalid. And it'd basically just be what it returns on Windows, which is the superset of both.
Yeah,
exactly. I mean that seems more useful than the current thing.
But yeah, this whole API and a lot of the ones on Path and File in general are kind of along the vein of, like, a lot of devs, especially when they're writing console apps or tools, don't care. They want to do things like if file exists, file create, and things like that. but in practice, those are bad practices because file system checks are inherently racy, and the second you check if it exists or not, that could change. And so it's I guess trying to find that balance between what are users likely wanting here versus the best practice of you just shouldn't be trying to use this at all. And I think I like Stefan's point of most of the time you do just want the superset across the API surface, which is just what Win32 returns. Because it's more obvious then.
Yeah, but like, I mean, so look at all the gray hairs here. Like I don't know that I don't know that FAT24 allows Unicode characters. So like, if you
Right.
want what is the union of all known file systems non-valid characters? Well, that's going to be a really big array because we have to conclude everything from Unicode.
Yeah.
Um,
Which gets back to
I'm just
Levi's
thinking of
allow list.
right. Well, so I'm just getting back to your kind of Blazor scenario. If you want something useful, I do not like when I'm running on a Unix server, or whatever, compiled for WASM, which I assume is kind of Unix, right? I'm pretty sure for this kind of stuff. Like at that point, I would rather just like raise an error when it's like the actual characters that I might be able to type on a keyboard that's likely to mess up, like really proactively. You know what I mean? It might be wrong, but at least that's useful. Like, you know what I mean? Just checking for null is not useful, like really, because I could do that already without calling this API.
In YouTube chat, they were talking about just replacing invalid characters with underscore, or sometimes just eliminating them entirely. But I think the thing that I think is still remaining unsaid, even though I keep trying to say it, is like invalid is really not on the list of valid characters, which means that you want to start with a list of valid characters, which is a finite list, and then invert it, and everything that remains is invalid.
Well, what about like unknown
Sherlock.
Unicode characters and stuff? Like that's theoretically supported by like a lot of file systems and stuff,
what
right?
was that?
Like or like Unicode code points that like haven't been defined yet, right? Like would you include that in the valid set? Probably.
It will. The way that NTFS at least handles that is too complicated to explain here, but I can tell you offline if you're interested.
Okay, that's
It's good
intrigued.
times.
Yeah.
It's very good.
Okay. But anyway, yeah, so my thought is either like let's not like expose this API anymore. Like I know that ship is sailed, but let's not do new stuff. If we do something, I think having like exposing the Windows list everywhere like could be somewhat useful, with the caveats that Levi points out that they're like this isn't like in really mean anything other than like for sure it will fail on Windows.
but I don't even know that's true.
Yeah, you think that like some of the invalid characters on Windows will actually succeed?
I don't know.
Like
I don't know what happens if you you can install a device driver to mount an ext4. I don't know if you submount an ext, if it pops off per directory and then gives the rest of the path to the new file system, then what an invalid path char could change mid path. If it pre-validates it, then that's the Windows concept versus the file system concept. But like at the end of the day, the directory owns what is and isn't invalid. And on Windows, we think of there being a drive with a file system, but that's not really how things work.
yeah, so we know for a fact there will be false negatives. We think that there might be false positives even in like kind of unique scenarios, in the sense that like maybe it could work even on Windows. But like, yeah. In that case, I just lean towards not adding the API.
Yeah. With all the caveats, I would also rather inclined to mark this as API rejected and have it as a I mean, I don't even know if that's a label, but
We just closed the issue. That's
oh yeah,
implicitly API rejected.
And then there's precedence that we don't want these kind of changes in PAT.
All right. So we don't often do this.
So in source.net, excluding tests, we have about 50 references to get invalid file name chars and get invalid path chars. If we don't believe there's a valid scenario, does that mean these are all bogus and we should go fix them all?
Or
Are
is that-
any of those usages Windows only? Oh yeah, I wonder if that makes a difference.
But what was the question?
Are any of the usages Windows only? If that makes a difference. But then of course there's Jeremy's point about custom device drivers.
Most of them are not Windows specific, if any.
Okay.
One of them is Unix specific, at least.
It depends on what you're using the return value for. If you're using the return value to mean that, if you're assuming that does not contain invalid characters means that it would be a valid file name, then that logic is incorrect and needs to be reassessed.
I mean,
Some of the
it's-
usages I'm looking at seems like it's just trying to avoid exceptions when trying to like create a file stream or something.
It's kind of
But
like
But if that's
file
if that's
exists.
the case that Levi just said, then that suggests that we have bugs that need to be fixed.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like file exists before file open, right? Like if you ask you use file exists in order to avoid an exception, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that you won't get other problems when you try opening the file.
Sure. But this suggests that there is a valid scenario.
Not necessarily, because you're
If people are
So-
using it as an optimization and it's a valid optimization, that's a scenario. If it's an
it's a
invalid
valid
optimization,
optimization
it's a bug.
if and only if the input's coming from a trusted domain.
But it's still a valid scenario.
Yeah, I
And-
think it's
and you only have one kind of file system on
Yes.
your reachable universe.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is we have a whole bunch of usage of it. It
Mhm.
can't both be the case that there's no valid scenario and we have usage of it.
But
One of those
here's
is
the
wrong.
thing, if someone's giving you trusted input, why are you even asking, is this input valid? Like, the input should be valid, trusted.
Sure. So
I'm not disagreeing. I'm saying we can't both have 50 occurrences checked into our source that are not bugs or not incorrect in some way and say that there's no valid scenario.
Right, so
will
I think
say that
that's-
this API was one of the APIs that was considered to be banned across Microsoft, like, because of how incorrect most of the usage is.
right. So I think you're saying we need to find all of our usages and
Yeah.
get rid of them.
Yes.
Right.
so I'm
If-
looking.
Not obsessive,
No,
not
so it's not
obsessive.
all invalid, right? Like it's a straw man. We're not saying that like every single usage is invalid. Like I'm looking at one right now in language services, which is like if invalid characters, send failure notification. If like you get an exception, send failure notification with the exception message. And it's like that's not wrong, but that doesn't mean we want to create more APIs around that pattern necessarily, right?
There's a difference between not wanting to promote it and saying there's no valid scenario.
Okay.
If we believe it contains both false negatives and false positives, then there's no valid scenario. Because any answer you get is not correct.
Again, I'll just reiterate. Either, okay, I won't reiterate that.
No, like I agree with you, Steve. Of if somebody wants me to change, we're not sure there's even a valid scenario, I'm happy to change that text. But if we believe that the current values are both false negative and false positive, there is no valid scenario, and we should have a bug that says we need to get rid of literally every usage out of .NET Runtime. If we're concerned that it's, well, we're going to be changing exception flow, so we're going to keep it for compat, that's a reason. But then we should definitely not add new ones, and we probably want an analyzer that says don't add any new ones.
Sorry, a silly question. Does keeping it for compat is a valid scenario?
Not for internal usage, but maybe for like not deleting it.
Yeah, I mean, if it would change what kind of exception gets thrown,
Exactly.
then that would be a breaking change, and
Therefore,
it needs to then be evaluated instead of just done.
okay.
If it's turning one I/O exception into another, then get rid of it. But if it's turning
but
an
if it's
argument
turning-
exception into an I/O
Yeah.
exception, then well, we can remove an argument exception. But if it's turning an I/O exception into an argument exception, I think we don't want to do that. But
That's
that
probably
would actually be the
not.
other, so.
That will probably be very weird.
Because in general, we can remove argument exceptions because it means we're just willing to accept a wider range of input. But we tend to be skeptical of adding an argument exception in front of a runtime exception.
Yeah. So now I also want to ask, should we obsolete these methods?
That would save us the trouble of writing an analyzer. Levi got kicked out of his room. I think with what we have on the screen, if we agree that there's no valid scenario, which mostly came from Levi, then yeah, I think we should obsolete them, which is weird because it means we'll turn this into an approved thing of completely the opposite of what it was asking for.
Yeah, my argument was, I think, a little different from Levi's, which is like, it didn't seem very useful. Like, they were probably like, it would be more useful to expose kind of the current Windows array everywhere if you want to at least try to not get 100% coverage, right? But like in a UI, like warn people when they're using characters that might be problematic, like as they're writing stuff. But yeah, if we're worried about the security implications, I think obsoleting would be the path. It does seem better than an analyzer.
What would
The
but yeah,
analyzer allows you to be flexible based on context. So if we're saying that I'm going to make up something, if we're saying that it's never valid to use get invalid path chars before saying new file stream, the analyzer could check for that combination. There are literally thousands and thousands of uses of path.getInvalid whatever on GitHub. If we're going to obsolete it, we better be darn sure we know what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
what would we give as a guidance for people to switch if, like, let's say we obsolete it, just like don't use it, figure out a different way, because if with all these usages, it's kind of hard to.
The
Well,
reason you would call it in the first place is because you're trying to implement some kind of policy within your application, and the policy is going to be specific to your business logic. Like .NET cannot universally say this is the policy that every application must have.
Well, and like I mentioned earlier, I think this kind of gets into the realm of things like file exists, where, you know, there's the thing that you should be doing, and there's the thing that people are going to do anyways because every other programming language exposes it and it's convenient for them in 90% of scenarios. And like, you should never be using file exists because it can be deleted the second you finished your check. We should have some kind of try API, or you should be using the create or open flags and things like that instead. But people are going to use file exists anyways. People will complain if we don't have it to no end, and there's no world where we can convince people they shouldn't be using it. So we need to provide it in effect anyways.
Yeah, and like the security issues that might come up from this are like kind of hard to assess, right? Because like if you're directly using that to save a file like a few lines later and that fails, like you're probably not in a much worse security situation, right? Like there's a lot of reasons files have failed to exist. I hope that most people don't assume just because, you know, the file name doesn't include something in this array or read-only span that like saving the file is going to work 100% of the time. So like hopefully they're ready for that. It gets more complicated, right, in web services where you might have multiple systems and you might have background jobs and it might fail later. You know, that people think the guarantees are stronger than it is. But yeah, I agree with Tanner. Like I think that we should give developers credit that they're just trying to be proactive and like they will handle errors if and when they happen later appropriately, because there's more reasons, you know, a file name may be invalid than just containing these characters. The thing I didn't want to do is create a new API that just returned a single element array of null and call it this on Unix, because of the multi-system thing. Like I think on Unix, if you're doing this kind of check, like it's because you're, you know, worried that it might go to some other service, you know, whether it be in the cloud or your own Windows box or whatever, that's like picky about file name characters. And this is like a common set to exclude. And it seems like kind of useful if it's like the big array that we expose everywhere that includes all the Windows characters that are at least commonly invalid.
Carl in chat says he's played with a custom file system in Windows before, and even if the file system allows things like colons, Windows create path blocks it, or create file blocks it. So apparently on Windows, this is possibly this is guaranteed to fail.
It might also depend on what API you use, because a lot of that changed with WSL, and we even had bugs with WSL where you could create files that only differed by case in NTFS, because NTFS technically allows it even though Windows blocks it by default. So I know that there's APIs that exist that allow you to bypass the normal create file validation checks.
All right. So what are we feeling, gang? Close, read-only span, obsolete.
My vote. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Tanner. All right, I'll go. I would say my first vote would be to expose the Windows list everywhere in a new API, but I see how that could be confusing to have like two similar things that return different things on Unix. So next vote is just reject the new APIs, but no obsolescence, and maybe an analyzer if we can detect bad usages, like without too many false positives.
Yeah, I was gonna say something similar. It sounds like there's too much nuance here. If people want to limit the allocations, they can cache it today. If we were to do something here, it sounds like the better thing would to be expose a different API with a better name that makes it clear what it's getting. You know, that maybe that could even be something like an overload of get invalid path chars that takes a operating system and allows you to say get me it for Windows versus Linux or something like that. You know, there's options there. It's not clear that's good, but if we were to do something here, it seems like it wouldn't necessarily be this API just because of all the nuance.
All right, so a lot of talk to reject and not do anything other than like maybe an analyzer if it's good.
All right. Hearing no counter positions being debated, it seems like our consensus is rejected. So, sticking with we're not sure there's even a valid scenario. There might be, we're just not sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. It's good to close one every now and then. Though I understand it's always sad to be the one that something gets closed on. Alright. Next up, system.link.shuffle 111221.
I think we should wait for Eric.
I was going to say, so Paulus isn't here, and I know I have a lot of implementation questions about this one. Okay. Add the possibility to pass key as a read-only span of byte in symmetric algorithm and keyed hash algorithm. So symmetric algorithm and keyed hash algorithm both have a property named key, which is a get set byte array. So if you have done key derivation into a stack allocated span, you have to call toArray, which makes another copy, and then you have more copies that you need to clear. And as part of doing this, we discussed we can also change all of our concrete implementations to not even use the array at all, and because the GC team doesn't seem to be pursuing the no compaction or clear on compaction GC modes with haste, so we can improve the security of, we can improve the auditability of people who are subject to stringent FIPS audits by moving our keys into malloc memory instead of GC memory. So a set key method that will set the key. If you read the array property, it will allocate a clone of the array, or it will allocate an array and return it, which is currently it returns a clone anyway. And then template method pattern, because we can validate the input. And Kevin wants us to reject the edit on keyed hash algorithm because there's an alternative approach for that one. I'm fine with that too.
So, Jeremy, a few, you might recall like 2 or 3 years ago, we had a proposal for secret of T, which I think got rejected. Why would it ever make sense to resuscitate that proposal, maybe slim it down so that it's just a key wrap, and then submit that along with these APIs to say, like, you don't really want a ROS byte, you actually want a secret key or something. And you could also pass that around if you need to.
I mean, I think even if we had that, there would still be argument that we want to take the ROS byte, because unless secret of T was a ref struct, then you couldn't derive into stack alloc and avoid copying it. an extra.
No,
time.
it would force a copy. You're right.
So this would basically maybe create one for you, but like in the case of OpenSSL, we would never need to create that intermediate thing.
Yeah.
We have our struct of, I don't know, fixed memory key box or something like that, which is malloc. So we internally have secret of byte. We just don't expose it.
And you said keyed hash algorithm would not get this API, just symmetric algorithm?
Yeah, so the keyed hash algorithm got included from a chat I was in yesterday, and then when they updated the proposal, Kevin pointed out that this is already solvable with cryptographic operations, HMAC data, and or incremental hash. They both accept a span key, and they're actually better for the target scenarios.
Sure.
So it'll mean ASP.NET has to change their HMAC factory to stop returning HMAC instances and start returning configured incremental hash or a wrapper that they write themselves to send it to HMAC data.
Sure.
So.
So which one are you taking, the public method or the protected virtual method? Because they both can't have the same name.
The protected virtual should say core. That's what I get for changing it to template method pattern 70 minutes ago.
Do you need a way to pull the key back out?
Reading the property will get it back out. It'll allocate an array, copy it into it, and return it.
Yeah, but isn't the entire point of this to avoid exposing the key to GC memory or to places where you don't necessarily control the lifetime?
Yeah, well, I don't think I've ever actually seen a good scenario for reading a symmetric key back. So
I mean, I agree with you on that.
Um,
Like it really should be a write-only property.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
See, VB was the cheerleader here. We should have listened to them.
yeah, and if somebody comes up with a reason why they need to get it back, well, for one, it's not guaranteed to work because there's symmetric algorithm instances where the key is in a non-exportable key in hardware, and because we support AES CNG or triple DES CNG being backed by an HSM, so the get key is not guaranteed to succeed. So people should already be not reading it.
I wonder if it should also be I just kind of want to put on the record that one of the other reasons not to do it for keyed hash algorithm is because what happens if you pass RAW's byte of empty or null inadvertently?
Yeah.
Like it's totally valid to have an empty key in a keyed hash algorithm.
Yeah, it's also valid for HMAX to have your non-effective key be 6 or 7 gigabytes, but the your ultimate key is only going to be the size nobody understands because you have to go look it up in a spec.
Yeah. But the whole like it's too hard for most people to distinguish between null and empty is that makes, to me, that's a good argument for not putting this on keyed hash algorithm in addition to any other arguments that Kevin was making recently.
Fair enough. All right. May not have anyone for this, but introduce logging, sampling, and buffering. .NET extensions 5123. It wasn't in the agenda, so nobody got tagged on it.
Yeah, this is we should wait for this one. and bring in the right folks.
Still don't have anybody to talk about LDAP session options.
Yeah, I pinged Steve offline, but I think he's just away from the keyboard.
All right. We have two other Eric Sarpalis, unless anybody wants to.
We can probably discuss the one that you're currently hovering over, because it's a simple thing with the right. It's just a question of where do we put it. So there's a general desire. We support creating various things with collection expressions, and some of them just work. Some of them are provided by the compiler, and some of them are provided via us adding the ability to kind of tell the compiler what it should use to build the relevant thing. There's a desire to be able to use a collection expression to initialize an IAsync enumerable, just like you can with an IEnumerable, mainly for testing purposes, because most IAsync enumerables are actually created via iterators or link or some other mechanism. But you can't do it today because the compiler doesn't know how to create an IAsync enumerable. We can trivially do this by exposing a create method or whatever we want to call it somewhere and tagging the interface to say, use that method to create one of these. But we need to figure out where to put that and what to name it.
Didn't we just create async enumerable to mirror enumerable?
We did, but we can't. We have to put the attribute on IAsync enumerable. It can't. We can't rely on you having a system link async enumerable NuGet package or assembly referenced, and B, we can't actually express it because we need to be able to refer to the type, and it would be a reference from corelib up to system link async enumerable.
Okay, so we added that as a fully oob. It's not a type forward. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, darn, because that would have been a perfect place to put it.
It would have been a perfect place to put it. We don't really have a great place to put it.
So
I see the one that I suggested, which is terrible, but I especially with system link async enumerable existing, I don't think developers really need to call this API directly. So we could bury it, and we could really bury it by putting it in on the async iterator builder type in system runtime compiler services. It's a horrible place for the method. We never want anyone looking at that type directly, but then again, we don't want anyone really looking at this either. So
IEnumerable works because the compiler special cased it?
Correct.
Why don't we just ask them to special case the IAsync enumerable?
We suggested it. Cyrus was hesitant.
Fair enough.
But we could. They view the compiler doing it as really needing strong need, which is valid, and us not being able to come up with a good name isn't super strong need.
Right. Well, because I assume our implementation of this is values.toArray.
Yeah. Well, effectively.
I guess we actually have to wrap it in a.
Yeah, we'd have an iterator that would.
Fair enough.
That would iterate through a thing, but yeah.
Fair enough. Well, because I was going to say if it was just
about
new array, then maybe we need a thing that says I'm totally assignable from new array, so just call new array. But
so, Steve, I think you said that you were concerned about how ugly the create method was. Was that your concern?
Oh, no, I was saying it doesn't need to be pretty because we can bury it somewhere. It doesn't need to take up a good name on a good name type is all I was saying, is because
yeah, because we normally EB never things that we expect the compiler to call,
right. Well,
I mean, under compiler services.
If we don't expect them to be also used by developers, yeah, we can EB never them
or
bury them in system runtime compiler services.
Would this be a candidate for something you would EB never, or do you think people might legitimately want to call this?
I would be fine putting EB never on it. My main pushback is creating a brand new type called async enumerable extensions, that doesn't hold any extensions.
Fair.
We could call it async enumerable Marshall and put it in system runtime interop services like collections Marshable, immutable collections Marshall, and the other specialized collection create APIs. Because we also have things like immutable array, to array that extracts the underlying array rather than actually converting, and the create from array that doesn't copy, things like that.
We could. There's nothing really unsafe or special about this. But yeah, I mean, we could.
Yeah, because normally the Marshall types allow you to do some kind of quasi-safe introspection of something. This isn't really introspection, right? This is safe creation because you're making a copy. But you could imagine that maybe maybe that gives you a type that you can add future APIs to, the Marshall type that Tanner suggested.
I guess my other question was going to be, so this takes read-only span, we have to copy. Don't the collection initializer, or don't the collection literal patterns support the signature taking T-array, and then we wouldn't have to necessarily.
We've proposed that with ownership transfer, but the compiler and language do not support that today.
Okay, so we don't want to risk the ownership concept, even if in 90% of scenarios the language would be doing it and we'd know it was safe.
Well, no, like the language literally today that will not work if you typed this as T-array instead of read-only span.
Oh, okay, I see. Yeah,
we could wait until the compiler has such a feature.
Yeah, we could. Well, and I guess it kind of touches on something that I had discussed with the language team around tensors, which is that, you know, the collection builder pattern today is fairly limited, and conceptually what I think we actually want is something more like interpolated string handler, which is we'd want a collection literal handler that allows you to get the individual parts, and so you could have something like tensors build itself efficiently from the separate dimensions or things like that. Or in this case, you could have an async enumerable that gets the parts and builds itself efficiently without forcing a full allocation of everything. It's kind of like what LINQ already does internally for stuff, but as a general pattern.
Yeah, I mean, if we were super concerned about efficiency here, that would be one reason we might want the compiler to synthesize an implementation, because you wouldn't even need the extra. Like if I had, open bracket 1, 2, 3, the compiler could emit that as the equivalent of an async iterator, yield return 1, yield return 2, yield return 3. We just haven't come up with scenarios where efficiency is particularly impactful here. It's generally test scenarios where you've got some dummy data, other than maybe empty.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, I think the current proposal is fine and fits the needs. Just wanted to better understand.
Yeah. If we could accept an array, I think we probably would.
And this doesn't block us from having that overload in the future and using overload resolution priority attribute or the language understanding or anything like that. So
right, we wouldn't even need that. We could just change what the collection builder attribute pointed to.
Right.
Although right now, I don't know if it knows how to disambiguate with overloads. Maybe we would need to use overload resolution attribute.
Yeah, but we have options if the language adds that support in the future, so that's good.
Anyhow, so if there are lots of places we can put it, we can hide it. I have an innate sort of I don't like the async enumerable extensions location.
I agree. And looking under compiler services, this felt like the most appropriate to me, but here
that was my suggestion only because I lacked a better place, and it's hidden away, and we actually, it's already in a NuGet package, so we could put this like async iterator, there's already the Microsoft.bcl.async interfaces package, which contains the definition of iasync enumerable and also that async iterator class, so this would also just sort of work down level implicitly. But it's also, I mean, it's pretty strange to have this on that type, but if it's hidden away, like maybe it's not a big deal.
Because I mean, well, it's not building a method; it is building an async iterator.
It probably will even use an iterator as an implementation detail just for simplicity. So, yeah.
And then, yeah, to me, once it's in compiler services, I don't see a reason to EB-never it. It's compiler services is implicitly EB-never.
Yeah, this is infrastructure. It's the only reason not to put it here would be if we felt like we wanted people to call it directly. And there doesn't seem to be a really great reason to do that.
Yeah, because the async enumerable NuGet package has a make an I enumerable I async enumerable. Like, you would lose the span in that case, but I'm sure
right.
somebody will
We
put on
can't-
Stack Overflow, hey, why does this work with the collection pattern but not with span? Oh, just call async iterator method builder.create async enumerable.
Oh, but no, but that's a good point. Does Microsoft BCL async interfaces where async iterator method builder lives down level, that doesn't have a reference to system.memory, does it?
I don't know. I don't think we'd be upset by adding
We're all
one.
checking NuGet. We're all checking NuGet right now. Correct. It has a dependency on compiler services unsafe, and it has a dependency on tasks extension. That's it.
And
Okay.
does unsafe depend on memory?
No, it
Probably
doesn't.
not.
It's fully staffed.
I mean, again, I
I
don't.
don't think task extensions does either. But it's probably not a big deal adding the extra reference, right? Everyone by this point has a reference to system memory somewhere in their graph.
Yeah, I
That's
assume so.
true. Yeah. And on recent versions of the runtime, it's just all going to type forward anyway, and you don't need the package, right?
Correct. And by recent, I think it's like anything newer than .NET Core 2.0.
Okay.
So since async iterator method builder was suggested, I looked and
Oh, wait, hold on. Is Microsoft BCL async interfaces one of those cases where we can't add anything new to existing types?
are the types in framework,
Yes.
like they're in .NET framework.
No. They're in .NET. They're in Corelib.
Let's see. We build it from runtime repo, right?
Yeah. Like, is this one of the things where we unify and therefore we can't add new instance methods because it type forwards
Yes.
into Corelib?
It's things like iasync disposable or type forwarded. What type are you trying to add to? Async iterator method builder? Yes,
That's
it's
what
type
I-
forwarded as well.
Yeah. So we either can't put it here or we can't do it down level.
Well, extension everything is supposed to be coming this release.
And you expect
Which
that to work
means-
down level?
Yes. But
Yeah.
I'd like to hear what Tanner's going to say because I'm not sure how that solves the problem.
Yeah, I was gonna say, depending on how the method overloading stuff works, we could just put it somewhere and make it appear like it's on async iterator method builder down level.
Right.
Because I think we could do it so that it's because the collection builder is compile time only, so Roslyn needs to be able to resolve it, not the user necessarily. We only need it resolvable for the user if they're calling it manually. So an extension covers that purpose, and we can just shove it anywhere for down level otherwise.
But then, maybe we don't care, but if you use a collection initializer for async enumerable, the generated code wouldn't unify, so you'd still be carrying around
Right.
the Microsoft BCL async interfaces package. But the only way to avoid that is if we add a brand new type to both CoreLib and Microsoft BCL async interfaces.
Yeah, and then at that point, there's no need to forward.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we would still want to unify them, so we would type forward the new thing.
Yeah. I meant extension, not forward.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Words are hard
Too-
today.
Too many words, too little time.
Well, I think we wouldn't want to type forward the new thing, because then it would just be the next thing now has to pretend to be an extension on the new extension of the new extension of the. Like at some point, you're just like, this is a utility method. Fine, it lives in the package.
Yeah, but it's a utility method that the compiler automatically uses.
But wouldn't the compiler prefer one in CoreLib? Maybe not. I don't know how it would actually resolve ambiguities there if you defined it in two different places.
Because if the interface type forwards from the package into the runtime, then, well, actually, if it type forwards, then this isn't going to help down level anyway. Because net 9, it would type forward into net 9's version, which would say it doesn't have a collection builder attribute. You can't modify async enumerable for previous .NET cores because it's type forward.
Oh, you're right. The interface itself.
So this is a net 10 only feature. No down level support. Like you just literally can't do it.
Well, you could down level. It would work for NetFX and Net Standard.
But it would
Well-
break for net 8 and net 9.
Yeah.
Well, so we could do it, and we could do it, but it would only work in a patch build. So, because it's that weird nuance of, are attributes part of public API service or not?
Right.
And
I mean,
we-
we could put it in the ref.
Yeah, and then it we can update the ref, because that's all the compiler's going to see is the ref. And we just basically say, if you want to use collection builder on 9, you need to be on the latest SDK, otherwise it doesn't work. Which isn't technically modifying the surface area, but also is.
I thought we had no ability to edit the target packs.
We must, because we patch them, right? But we've always been concerned about adding APIs there, because then it depends on what patch you have as to whether you can do something. We must have the ability to service, right? 'Cause
Right.
That's how we service. Don't our source generators ship in the target packs?
I think so. And so we have the ability to update the target pack, but we don't want to be in a world where, whether or not we don't want to be in a world where someone compiled against 90200 and then some user tries to run it on 90100 and it fails. Whereas this would be, it's only if you're compiling on 90100 it would fail, because no attribute exists. So it's safer.
Well, but that
No, but
still
it-
means that on .NET older, we'd have to target a method that already exists.
Yeah.
We would need an existing method that took a read-only span and returned an async enumerable.
Right, because if 90200 introduces both the attribute and the target method, you compile against that, and then you run on 100, you're going to get method missing exception at runtime.
And we don't have such a method.
Yeah.
Right.
If
so
we
that'd
did,
be the
yeah.
problem.
So yeah,
I mean, you
if
can always
that
service that. But,
yes, if assuming that the package doesn't have a unified ref, because apparently most of our NuGet packages no longer publish refs, then yes, it could be exposed in the NetFX and the Net 10 versions, but Net 9 and older would not work.
So it's time for a new language feature, extension attributes.
Yeah.
But that's okay though, right? Because if someone was having trouble because they were compiling against an older version of the runtime or compiling against that standard or whatever, like, then they don't get the language candy, as it were. They don't get the syntactic sugar, but they could still return an array is an async enumerable, couldn't they?
No. Array doesn't
Not even
include
going through this helper method, calling it manually?
the. Oh, well, you could call it manually, sure.
Yeah, you just don't get the syntactic sugar, but you
No,
can
but
still do
net
it.
standard
had-
net
if you
standard
had
would have to
method-
reflect call it. Net standard would never see this method.
I mean, it's not
No,
a
it-
complicated method to write. You could write
Yeah.
a two-line iterator that for each to know array and yield returned. But if this method wasn't if the method's available, the compiler will use it. If it's not available, you can't call it.
Because if the point is we want to put it on an existing type, and that type is type forwarded out of the package, then well, we could expose it to net standard as an implementation. But if you ran on net 9, it would be a missing method exception because it's a
Oh
type
no,
forward.
this would need to be on a new type if we did this. If you wanted it to work down level.
Yeah, but now we're back to the ugly. We're adding a type with one method that we don't really want to exist.
And you wouldn't get syntactic sugar in either case. You'd have to call
So-
the method manually.
So maybe we should have another conversation with Cyrus et al. About compiler support.
Yeah, if we want it to work for net standard compilation, we either need a new type that only has one method, which is just going to add yet another type that lives in the package that we've type forwarded so we can't add methods to, or the compiler just supports it and then it works everywhere.
And
But you
even
don't
if
get
we
the syntactic sugar.
you don't get this, you would have to if you were on .NET 9, you would need to add a reference to Microsoft BCL whatever in order to pick up. Oh no, you still wouldn't get the syntactic sugar, right?
It
There's
turns
no
out
way to get the syntactic sugar .NET Core down level
Unless the compiler
unless the compiler does.
adds it as special case and just splats the method in as an internal somewhere.
All right, let's mark this as
Needs work.
needs work, and we'll follow up.
Notably, the language could, instead of baking that in, it could also just expand the collection builder support and could allow collection builder to be provided in other ways.
I mean, silly question. Like, wouldn't a package like Polysharp kind of do this for you anyway?
There's no way with collection builders today to like attribute extend some other type.
Right. You can't use a source gen for this because you need to change the original interface.
We'd need either some kind of like collection builder for attribute you can place at the assembly level that says, you know, I'm providing this collection builder for this type that I don't have, and and the one on the type wins if both exist. So, or you would need some kind of extension attributes or something along that lines that would allow it.
Yeah, because I was thinking that the source generator would have the ability to kind of interject itself before that point, but it sounds like the answer is no. It would still be a compiler error.
Yeah.
Because the syntax is literally invalid before the source generator even gets a crack at it. Is that the issue? Or some other type of error has occurred before the source generator gets a chance to run.
Yeah, I found that the collection builder stuff, what we have is great and it works for a lot of the scenarios that we have today, but especially for tensors, I've been finding a desire for it to be expanded a bit more.
Yeah.
So maybe this is just one more thing that would be nice to expand and bring along as part of that overall discussion to find out what the language team would like to do, if anything.
All right. Have I captured all of the words anyone cares for?
Yeah. Well, is this approved for net 10, or are you going back to the drawing board just because you also wanted to work down level?
With an interface like async and enumerable, I feel like we should do our best to have it work regardless of what version you're targeting, especially because the other interfaces do. Pretty much all the other collection-related interfaces in CoreLib all just work. but they just work mainly because the compiler provides an implementation. So it feels a little strange that this would only work on 10. If that was the best we could do, then it's probably fine. But I'd like to have the conversation about whether we should add this to the list of compiler ones.
And I think I see Steve Harder.
Yes. Welcome, Steve.
All right. LDAP session options dot certificate directory property 104260.
I guess you can read this here, but it does have some history. I did save the original request a little bit down below. Basically, we worked with this customer that wanted this feature, and we provided them a prototype of these two new members here, this one property and this one method. And it did work for them. It did address their scenario. Booya worked on that, so I kind of picked up from where she left off. And basically what this does is, if you want to, on Linux only, using our OpenLDAP APIs, if you want to be able to specify, if you want to use TLS with SSL and you need to specify certificates, there's a few different ways to do them. In this particular scenario, they did not want to, they didn't have necessarily permission to go on the direct machine and like set an environment variable globally, or specify the target LDAP server, which can have the certificates. I'll take that back. Sorry, I'm not going to go that deep. But basically, what this property does, certificate directory, is specifies a directory that has a bunch of certificates in it. It could just have one. They're hashed by subject name, and when you specify this, then LDAP, when it connects to the server, will look for the appropriate one and just pick it up. So it's convenient for some people, depending on their scenario. And this other method, I believe it's only necessary if you've already used your created a connection, and it kind of creates this context the first time you use a connection. So this kind of just resets it, because this particular property is kind of a global across, well, all subsequent connections at that point. So the combination of these two were requested by Linux users. Windows has a different way to do this. So these will be flagged as Linux only, and then throw platform not supported exception on Windows.
I scrolled down to your example usage, and like I'm not super familiar with this space, but so do these contexts they outlive the connections then, presumably?
They're kind of like variables. You set them, and then every connection you create from that point forward will use these context variables. So if you want to change a global, you have to get a new context, and this helper method, start new TLS session context, will let you do that.
So if we didn't have this method, this just wouldn't work, or it would be kind of arbitrary when it picked up the.
Yeah, because I think the idea is that if you didn't need the certificate directory maybe right away, maybe you don't have a connection that needs TLS or SSL, then you can kind of defer that, I guess, till you need it. I wasn't part of the original prototyping on this, but I know we had to add this method, which just internally calls an LDAP function. I mean, this is not something we made up. It's very simple. It's like, you can look at the attached PR, but it's basically, almost a one-liner to call into open LDAP APIs and pass a particular const that represents, start new session context.
Yeah, I was just curious, like, would it make sense to go inside, like, just combine it inside the setter or something? Though at that point, it might not be a setter. But yeah,
Yeah, all of the APIs that we have, well, maybe not exactly all of them, but the majority of them are just very simple wrappers on top of OpenLDAP. And OpenLDAP has, at least for the session properties here, has basically a const, full of, here's 30 different methods to call. And, you specify the method, and then, the input and output varies a little bit depending on what you're calling. But basically, we just wrap the existing or consts, one to one. We don't. try to
okay. I
wrap
mean, that
everything on
seems reasonable. I guess I was just more curious than anything why, like, there were session options before, but I guess this is specifically a TLS session context, and the other
Yeah,
options are not
yeah.
around TLS.
And I didn't show on here, all of the existing methods that we have. There's quite a few.
So LDAP session options to me feels like it's a property bag. So start new TLS context as a method feels wrong.
There already is a method on there, though, like a start and stop method pair that performs a side effect.
So it's not an options bag, it's describing a current connection.
You get from the connection. I think if you scroll down to the example, you can get the options from the connection.
So you create a connection, and then
You create a
God,
connection, and
that
then
is the
you
worst
set
syntax I've ever seen.
then you basically you create the connection. You don't use it yet. You set some properties, and then when you use it, it's kind of creates the context, and from that point forward, everything's kind of locked down for that particular connection. And then some of those properties affect the context, but you don't really know necessarily which ones do that, which is something I recently found out.
So when would it have connected? Like, does it connect it?
In this particular case, nothing is connected until you either call the search request. I believe will make sure everything is done. Actually, bind. Okay.
Right.
I would assume it's bind. Yeah.
And I believe I might have to double check this. I think start new TLS session context internally in LDAP now might also do a bind. So I'm not sure if that bind is completely necessary, but I think it is at this point. So
I'm just wondering why the new method is needed, because if you're supposed to set all of the options before you call bind, why do you need to reset the connection?
Well, apparently this context outlives the connection, like, which seems kind of weird too.
yeah, LDAP has this way you can set properties after you created a connection and used it, and they kind of are in a pending state at that point. And then when you call the start new whatever, that kind of moves from the pending state to the current.
Because, all right, so I can say the name of the certificate directory property is atrocious, and we can't use it because it's not a directory where you're looking for certificates. It seems to be the directory that is if the TLS connection chains up to a certificate in this directory, it is trusted. So the word trust needs to be in here somewhere. It's not where your client auth cert comes from. It's not where a server cert comes from. This is a trust decision. So it's not certificate directory. It's not tilde console my certs. Like, this is supposed to be like Etsy SSL certs of trust, or if you want a context specific one, it's some other trust location, not just like where my certs live. Which I can tell because the name of the property is CA Certdir, which means they're using it for OpenSSL Trust.
CA for certificate authority there.
Yeah. So certificate trust directory is fine, but or CA certificate directory, though I don't think we've used the CA abbreviation anywhere before.
You could say trusted certificates directory or something like that.
Yeah. But like the notion that this is a trust thing and not a generic lookup, I think is important to have in the name.
Agree. The
Yep,
the start
makes
method
sense.
being added. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I think that was Tanner.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that the start method being added, like, given that there's already a start stop method pair on there, like, I'm just kind of willing to let it slide. Like, it matches an existing pattern, as weird as it might be.
Well, again, this start new TLS session context. If it basically, I just pasted the const there, new CT or TLS new context. It's different than start stop. If that's what you're asking,
It's a method on the options, though. I think is so. There's the pattern, even if it's like doing different things.
Yeah.
And as strange as it is, like, it is locally consistent because, as I mentioned, the pattern already exists on there. So it's like, okay.
Yeah, again, these internally just call, more or less the same single LDAP method, passing a const and the loosely typed variables. So it doesn't necessarily differentiate.
Does
Yeah,
the
because it's a method that you need to call now. It's not something that you defer calling until bind, right? Like, you
Yeah,
need to call set
right.
string option immediately.
And really, that's all this does is set this particular LDAP, whatever TLS underscore new const to 0. I mean, it's a property internally, but we don't want people to know the magic number, which is 0 here. Maybe other numbers work too, but the doc says set it to 0.
By the way, you have as a comment, it throws PNSE on non-Windows, but in your sample usage, you say debug assert is Linux.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was. Yeah, I can update that. That was.
Okay, that's just a copy paste error. Okay.
Well, yeah, it was original from an email thread. So.
I mean, what do we do on Mac? Do we not have LDAP on Mac, or does it use the same code?
Uses the same as Linux.
Does the start new TLS session context, is that also not Windows?
Right. Both of them, they're all. Yeah, so I can update that.
So they'd have, so the platforms that they'd be supported on, I guess, are Linux, Mac, like iOS, Android, stuff like that, or like what's the scope here?
You mean, can you repeat that?
Do you have a finite list of platforms that you support or platforms that you don't support? So, for example, if we say unsupported on Windows, does that imply that, like, iOS and WASM and Android and other stuff also support it?
I have to look at the code to see what it supports right now. I don't know.
Because I think, Jeremy, we have the ability to say it's only supported on specific OSs.
Yeah, but we don't have a
opposed to
word
not
for
supported.
Linux.
Really? Oh, yeah, I guess it makes sense.
Also, because Linux isn't Linux. Linux is Linux and
Yeah.
FreeBSD and NetBSD
Yeah.
and OpenBSD.
Distro
And,
of your choice, yeah.
yeah, so it's all of the things that are well defined have names, but if something only works on Linux, we can only describe that as it's not supported anywhere that has a name.
And to be fair, the existing APIs are very bad at this, and they don't actually even throw platform not supported exception. They're like, well, if it's not supported, you'll get some exception, probably an LDAP exception. So I tried to formalize that a little bit here, and from talking to Eric St. John a little bit ago, we thought we would try to formalize it and lock down. Not in this particular issue in PR though. Locked is down better than it is today because it's
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
very free today.
What I was getting at though is, Jeremy, you might know the answer. Do we have like an actual exhaustive list of all the different platforms somewhere that we can just check this against to make sure we're not missing anything?
We might. I don't know where it would be.
I wonder if maybe Eric St. John would know.
Because I know that tvOS inherits iOS. Oh, so I missed macOS.
Yeah.
Which I think is lowercase. So iOS might be lowercase. Maybe they're all lowercase. These look wrong. I don't know. It should be right, whatever it is. Yeah, I mean, or we could just say that they don't get annotated and they just throw when you're on the wrong platform. If there are already
Right,
other things on it that misbehave. Do we need the word context in the start new TLS session?
I think the const has CTX on the end of it. That's
Sure.
where that came from.
But is that a thing anybody understands or cares? Or should it, like, do we want start new versus restart, or reset, or like,
I think we want to keep context because there is concept of well, the connection being like a session, I guess. Like session is you know, the one layer, and then context is another layer.
Yeah, the man page also uses the term context, not session.
yeah, but that's because they're describing OpenSSL's API, where they're saying this is an SSL CTX an SSL CTX instead of an SSL, but like that is 100% leaking their implementation. But it's fine. It's just how many of these words are actually important is really the question. But
Yeah, and the reason that I focused on what the man page said is because that might, if we choose naming that kind of corresponds with the man page, then people might recognize that these two things are the same. But you're right, it is leaking the context, but it's leaking the context in a way that helps discoverability.
And then what happens on Linux when you don't set the new directory? It's OpenSSL's defaults?
If you don't set this directory, you mean?
So
Is that what you asked?
yeah, so presumably this is actually null.
Right.
So null means, I guess null is open LDAP, do whatever you want to do. Which is either going to be OpenSSL's default or hard-coded to Etsy SSL certs, or whatever the answer is in open LDAP, because we're just...
Yeah, you can set
dispatching.
an environment variable to specify this directory as well. That might be what people are doing.
It sounds like open LDAP is just saying OpenSSL do whatever you want to do, because if it's SSL certdir, that's OpenSSL bleed through. So if it's open LDAP certdir, then open LDAP's doing something.
And backing up quite a bit here, the original request was actually to get Windows has this callback method to validate the certificate, and then you can give them the hash or whatever the certificate, do whatever you want. So really, I think that the original request wasn't is to help with the validation of the cert. You'll probably get an error later, but you might not get a nice exception.
Yeah, I mean, this is all... Honestly, this is all weird because it's... If we were to decide to try writing LDAP ourselves, we would not support this. We would make the callback work instead of support. You get to specify a directory, but we're probably not going to write LDAP ourselves, so I guess it's fine.
The intro mentioned macOS. Is that supported by this?
Oh, that's true. I think
Yeah,
he said
it
so.
yeah, it
Leaving
does say
macOS was. He said we did use the same library.
and unfortunately, our tests that we have in this area on Linux, including Mac, have to be run manually. So we couldn't automate them. It requires some Docker instances to run and other things that were, I guess, were problematic when this was added a couple of releases ago.
And when do we go with like supported versus unsupported? Because like, what about FreeBSD? Would it make sense just to say it supports Linux and
Well,
macOS?
that's the thing is we don't. To my knowledge, we've never said supported OS Linux because when we say Linux, we almost always include FreeBSD, NetBSD, and OpenBSD, and we don't have any notion of those identifiers appearing in our support matrix.
I mean, looking at supported OS platform on source.net, Linux shows up a lot in like systemnet HTTP and
Okay,
in a lot of places.
I guess I'm wrong. I thought we had never used that word because it often varied by distro, and B, because other reasons. But apparently I'm wrong. The other... So, closer to the name of the property is certificate authority directory, which authority is a word that means trust.
I will say a lot of the usages do appear to be like private or internal APIs.
So, does anybody have opinion of trusted certificates versus certificate authority?
I like trust, but I don't know. Both seem fine, but
Having
like
certificate directory next to each other,
No.
you know, more closely aligns with
Well, these are
underlying
these are
costs.
alternate names for the same.
Well, yeah, but I mean, one of them has certificate directory together, and one of them splits it in with authority in the middle. I'm just looking at the const. You know,
Sure.
Normally we try to name these as close as we can to the const.
I literally do not care about that. Our expectation is not that someone who's using this has come from OpenLDAP. We should expose
help
the right
them,
thing
though.
to the users, and then we do the mapping. So it should be expressed more in terms of .NET things than OpenLDAP things.
I still like the first one. I don't mind that certificate directories close together, even if that doesn't matter.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. I'm just saying I literally do not care what the const is named. But all right. Do you have anything else on this one?
Nope, that's it. Thanks.
I should say partial.
There's a question in YouTube chat. The directory, sorry, the property points to a directory of certs, not to a specific cert, correct?
Yes, it points to directory. There is also a different const that lets you specify a single cert. I think in the scenario here is that you know, you have multiple certs. Multiple certs, and you don't want and you have an endpoint, and you just let things happen, and you don't want to tightly couple
Well,
two.
assuming it's
Is there a
CA
particular-
certificate file, that's actually supporting a multi-PIM, so it's multiple certificates, not just one. It's just one file.
Would users know what the structure of that directory has to look like?
No, unless they read the doc, are familiar with OpenLDAP. I mean, like I mentioned, it's what it is a bunch. It's the certs, but they're hashed on subject name. So it doesn't actually like walk, through each one and look to see if it matches, other than by file name.
But we would be able to link back to some authoritative reference that says this is how the files in the directory are supposed to be laid out. This is what
Right. Yeah, the PR I have up right now doesn't really have any doc. In fact, I added a little doc, but it's not in the right spot, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. If we wanted it to be easier to use, then we would go with the file instead of the directory. But if the people who have asked for this already have the OpenSSL cert name hashed directory structure built, because again, this is not an OpenLDAP thing at all. OpenLDAP doesn't know what any of this means. They've just passed an option to OpenSSL.
Yes. Okay.
So you might find it in OpenLDAP documentation only if they copied the OpenSSL documentation. But this is 100% leaking implementation details. If we want trusted certificates file for the multi-PIM, that's at least people can reason about it. I don't care which way we go. I don't think anybody will get this right. So I guess I slightly think it's wrong.
It's
but
honestly,
I don't care.
yeah, it's honestly, yeah, it's completely exposing, like you said, the internal implementation and differences between Windows and Linux. But if you actually look at what's already there, half of the methods are the same. I mean, this only works in Windows. This only works in Linux. So from that aspect, this isn't really making it worse because it was kind of designed that way, for better or for worse.
All right, sounds like we're letting this go as is. Since this says NPR, do note that we changed the name of the property.
Mm-hmm.
All right, anything else? In that case, thanks everyone for joining. Definitely had a lot of vibrant communication in chat, particularly around invalid path characters. And we'll see you all back here on our same .NET time at our same .NET channel next Tuesday. Until then, Auf Wiedersehen.